Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Empyre Avengers number 3. So, I I've reviewed quite a bit of Empyre books at this point. While I found the core event kind of promising at first, and even the first Empyre Avengers number 0 book pretty fun as a setup for a potential story. My disillusionment with Empyre is well documented at this point, as I've reviewed all the issues of the core series, and you can see how my initial concern that the story was going to turn into a standard alien invasion plot with a bunch of plant people was very much a valid concern, because that's what ended up happening, and it's weakened a lot of these Empyre books. Some of the tie-ins have been very strong, like to a degree, both of the X-Men books have been pretty interesting. Kind of mostly due to their current status and imaginative, like, new setting and such. That Krakoan stuff just led to interesting plot lines, and they have interesting enough writers that even with this plant thing, that those Kotati just sort of served as the background to do some cool stuff with some fun X-Men characters. On the other hand, this Avengers book has kind of just been about the Avengers dealing with the alien invasion, and in that regard, it's been pretty standard as far as like a tie-in such as this would be. And what I'm saying like that is, if this were a tie-in for something like Secret Invasion, I feel like it would be quite similar to this. However, one thing that does distinguish it a little bit, while Jim Zub does a pretty standard job with writing, Carlos Magno, Espen Gruntergen, and his coloring, and Ariana Maher doing lettering, they all do a very good job showcasing a pretty cool looking comic in terms of its visual design. A lot of this story revolves around the Savage Land, which can be a pretty standard kind of jungly setting, yet these artists do a great job at really showcasing it. There's a great spread pretty late into the book, featuring a whole lot of dinosaurs that's just so awesome looking and full of vivid detail that kind of caps off this tie-in a decent way. So on the whole, this is a fairly competently made comic. It's probably the strongest out of these Jim Zub Empyre Avengers books, but I don't think I would recommend the tie-in as a whole, and as such, it's hard to recommend this final issue. Yeah, and that's all I really have to say for a spoiler-free review. But since I clearly am not recommending it, let's just dive into what actually happens in this book. Although I have to say it's not a ton. We begin with, I guess, Shauna sort of flashing back and thinking about her relationship with Kazar, who was stabbed by the Ebony Blade in the last book. But the Ebony Blade is not a normal weapon, and it absorbs souls. I Am True Skills says, "Is Empyre getting good? I stopped reading." Well, no. If you missed my first little spiel, I think it got a lot worse. So if you weren't sold on those beginning issues, I would be shocked if you were going to enjoy the later half of it. And it's definitely worth skipping at this point, especially because we're nearing the tail end. Anyway, so yeah, the Ebony Blade absorbs souls. Meanwhile, Vision, Dr. Nemesis, and Luke Cage are fighting Plant Man in Manhattan. That stuff is a very small part of these Empyre Avengers books, but I do like Dr. Nemesis as a character, so it is at least a little entertaining. We also cut to Mexico, where Wonder Man, Mockingbird, and Quicksilver are trying to keep the Kree and the Skrulls from killing each other. Like I've said before about this particular plot point, I think it's interesting, but it's also very small, and it basically gets resolved here, where Quicksilver, and it's a fun scene, Quicksilver runs around and steals every single weapon from the Kree and the Skrulls, and that particular story beat ends with Quicksilver just throwing their weapons into the ocean, and you just see him in front of this huge mountain of alien gear doing so. It's a cute little bit, and certainly one of the stronger elements of the Empyre Avengers book is these other parts of the world doing things, but like I said, the focus is really on the Savage Land, and it's fine. Um, we cut back to that. Shanna, uh, the Scarlet Witch, and I guess Black Knight, along with Dr. Druid, work together to restore Kazar. Yeah. It's a pretty standard scene, I guess, in terms of just like they're fighting around the Kotati doing this. So it's all pretty normal actiony stuff. But he is restored and he kind of becomes part of the Savage Land, much like her, which is something, I guess. And then we get that awesome spread with all the dinosaurs, the Savage Land having come to recognize the Kotati are this sort of external threat, and it works together with the heroes to basically imprison the remaining aliens. They say, well, you've stopped us, but we're just a scouting party among many, and we'll report this all back to Koi, our leader. Uh, Pretty standard ending, although I don't dislike the, oh, we'll get you next time Avengers aspect of it. And then Scarlet Witch is contacted by Shuri, and they basically allude to the content in Empire number 5, where Wakanda has fallen. The last 2 pages are kind of the reading order of this list, and I notice we're deep into it at this point, with just the final phase and no other tie-ins that I've pulled. So one more Empire book, pretty much, and I am perfectly fine with that at this point, because I am pretty much done with this event, and what more can they possibly do in a final issue? Maybe they'll set up some more interesting stuff for future galactic politics, for the Guardians of the Galaxy, and possibly the Avengers to deal with in the future. Maybe the Fantastic Four as well. But setting up something in the future just means that Empire itself is that much more pointless, because if that's all it can offer after all of this, that's pretty disappointing, especially because this book really had me thinking in the larger context of like, well, this event's closing up, and this is Marvel's like big thing of the year. Sure, there's an X-Men event coming up, but that's not going to involve the whole company, mercifully. And Empire was going to be that big thrust. Maybe there would have been more to this particular storyline if the pandemic hadn't have happened and a bunch of tie-ins hadn't have had to have been cut. But that's not... I can't review a what-if scenario. Just going by the Empire books that exist, this event is hardly worth your time or your money. I got some interesting comments about that from the Cable books, where people were a lot more down on it and the current status of the X-Men situation, but I find that stuff way more entertaining and with far more purpose than anything we're getting out of Empire right now. So you talk like when some of these commenters were talking about the relative value of these books, and I usually bring that up when I feel appropriate, and I felt Cable, with its pretty stellar artwork and relatively entertaining character work, was worth the price of admission. In comparison, a lot of these Empire books do not meet that standard. I tend to also pull back from value judgment a little bit, because people have different views of that. Some people pay less for digital books. Others pay considerably more across exchange rates than what I relatively pay. So I try to let that sort of be your call based on what you pay for comics. Maybe you don't pay anything. So whatever the case may be, I just sort of describe the book and whether or not I think it's worth your time, and I guess to a lesser degree money, but that's sort of your call, because for some of these books, like, you can get good deals on Comixology and such, or maybe you don't pay for DC books at all through their subscription service if you're an American. I still believe that service is completely unavailable to us here in Canada, but I am a Comixology member, and it does help me keep up with a lot of books, because you can get them for a good price, often. Especially if you're kind of looking out for sales or are a member of their Unlimited thing, which I am. You kind of just get a blanket discount, which helps justify a lot of these purchases. Of course, all these live reviews, I usually do the print ones, unless I randomly have caught up on something in the digital world. But there's also a certain value you get out of the print book. I don't mind having bought this book because it's got some cool images. The first page is a very cool shot of a bunch of Savage Land characters battling a giant octopus. And it looks great. It's got a good use of color to reflect the fact that they're underwater. It's got a ton of detail and just really lives up to the nature of the Savage Land. So that's where it's hard to be super negative about this book. Not that I'm particularly motivated to, because yeah, the plot's okay, but there's just not a lot of substance to it. But there is some pretty substantial art, so it's hard to discount the book entirely. And again, I don't find myself overly motivated to do so. Empyre is kind of interesting like that. It hasn't really treaded into terrain that terrible in terms of quality for me to be dead set against it, but it's also very pointless and just completely lacking in story. In some ways, that does make this tie-in and the Empyre Core series worse because the writing just doesn't live up to the artwork. Because there's some really cool artwork here, and I'm a fan of Savage Land stuff. Hey Akbar, thanks for joining us. I don't really have a lot more to add, unfortunately, so you're kind of coming in near the end of my review. But if you guys have any thoughts on Empyre Avengers or Empyre in general, feel free to leave a comment below or say your bit in live chat now as I kind of close up. Because otherwise, I do want to also talk about another book today, because I have one more pull, and it's a substantial one that ended up at the back of the line, because I like doing these in random order, and I kind of maintain that. It's a fun climate for me where, I don't know, it just sort of, it removes the influence of the most popular stuff automatically getting to go to the front, which I think is ultimately for the best. But yes, we are still going to talk about Three Jokers, and I will do that at some point this afternoon in Canada time, wherever you may be. Akbar is saying, oh yeah, that was very good. Can't wait for number 2. Well, we'll talk more about it when I get around to it. And Jam Calax, Smoke Bomb, hello. I feel bad when it kind of works out that way. I try and give a decent warning for the stream, but then we end up, I think the way YouTube works is as these streams go on, more people see the notifications and then come on, only to see me wrapping up. Because yeah, Jamcal X is joining us, Tevia Smoke is joining us. And if you guys want to talk about anything, we still can. But a lot of these live reviews are just sort of meant to be a quick little thing anyways. So I guess we'll leave it there. A pretty disappointing book overall, and probably the weakest out of what I reviewed this week. Every book had pretty strong artwork, so it really just comes down to their stories. And Avengers story is very weak. Alrighty, well, Akbar is saying Empyre is disappointing overall. Yeah, and I talked about that a bit in this review. I think it's a little bit... It hit pretty hard for me, because up until now, Al Ewing had a clean slate from me in terms of having this consistent output of pretty high quality content out of his Marvel books. But those events always put even good writers through a ringer, and even he couldn't seem to pull it off. It's always so disappointing to see that, because I think it reflects how Marvel tends to publish these events, and so rarely do we get something solid. Tevye is saying, yeah, I'm basically bored with Empyre. That's kind of how I feel about it. And I talked about how there's still 4 tie-ins left. Well, 5. And I don't really intend to order any of them, unless I already have and have forgotten since then, which is possible. That happens quite a bit. But I am pretty dissatisfied with this overall. Akbar said, yeah, I think I had the same expectations, fair enough. I really was hoping for more, because you look at... I first got introduced to Al Ewing through his Secret Wars tie-in way back then, and have kind of followed some of his books here and there, and they're pretty reliable. He's got awesome Hulk books, his Immortal Hulk series is great. He is doing some interesting stuff with Guardians of the Galaxy right now, who are interestingly uninvolved in all of this stuff, which I thought was weird. But if you look at what their story is right now, that kind of makes sense. Um, and it just seems like a strange beast. It was cool to involve the Avengers and Fantastic Four on the story. So even taking aside all the stuff behind the scenes, I was kind of looking forward to that too. An event with them together. The last time they went and did something like, oh, we're going to go back and let a team work together again, we got Axis, and I loved Axis. Tevye is saying, my expectations weren't high for Empyre. Well, fair enough. And ultimately, you and several other viewers that commented early on with far more skepticism than I had were ultimately more correct. So credit to you guys. Tevye is saying Marvel events are really disappointing these days. See, I feel like they've had stronger moments in the last couple of years, which is where Empyre is an unfortunate, huge step back towards more traditional modern Marvel events, which all just suck. Akbar is saying we got one good book in X-Men 11 at least. I would say Empyre X-Men number 1s through 3 were also rock solid fun. Tevye is saying X-Men was fun enough. And X-Men number 11 was also great. Just a, like, perfect Magneto book in a certain sense. And very strong on the whole, without a hint of Exosword's build-up, even though it had that on the cover, which was kind of amusing. Tevye was saying X-Men was fun enough. I thought that Genosha business was so great. If you haven't read that book and you're looking for, like, just a decent little mini-series, doesn't even matter if you care about Empyre or not. That little... there's like, yeah, it's called Empyre X-Men, and it runs for 3 issues, and it's by or 4 issues, I should say, and it's by all of the current X-Men writers, and I loved it. I think that was so strong, and it stands on its own, relatively speaking. You kind of have to know who the Horticulture is, and they were set up in earlier X-Men books, but whatever, it's not that important. Jam Calyx was saying, seeing Black Knight and how he will be in the movie, do you have any thoughts on the relaunch trailer for the Eternals? You know, I haven't seen that, so maybe I should go take a look. I didn't know that was out. But I thought it was interesting what they've been, like, how they kind of killed off the original Eternals and early on in Jason Aaron's Avengers books, and I think they're posing themselves to set up an Eternals team more closely resembling whatever the MCU has planned. You know, I think the the Eternals at least stands to help broaden the horizons of the MCU a little bit, and it's different. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing something a little different. Maybe it's kind of what they were planning originally to do with the Inhumans, anyways. So we will see. Tevye Smoka says, speaking of Marvel events, aren't we getting Outlaws? I believe you're referring to... Is that the story with, like, the younger superheroes basically being outlawed in New York City? Because I read, like, the first Miles Morales book of that, and I think I ordered the next one, and we'll probably review both of those books. So, if so, yeah, that's kind of like a smaller scale event, though, featuring some of those younger heroes, and I kind of like them butting heads with authority figures. Tevye's saying, yeah, that is... I am correctly identifying it. I think it's got a lot of potential, like I said, because it's got the right attitude, and that first Spider-Man book was pretty strong on the whole. All right, so I think we'll call it there. We did manage to get a little bit of extra chat in when we had more viewers coming in, which is always fun, but we'll talk more once we talk about Akbar is saying try to catch 3 counts later. I don't know exactly when that is because I have to read the book first. I was kind of started on it, but haven't actually gotten around to doing that yet because it's a little longer and I wanted to really soak that one in. So yeah, thanks for watching. Tevye, Jamkal, Akbar, and even I Am True Skills for all participating in chat. Always fun to talk to you guys. I think you've all talked on chat before, which is cool. And we'll see you next time. Have a good one.